Good morning, Jules, and thank you for joining me. And I'm really excited and interested to talk to you about what you're doing with your brand, Ham Street Wines. And yeah, we've got quite a lot to talk about. There's quite a few things I want to ask you. But first of all, just tell me kind of who you are and what led you to starting a winery.
Yeah, so great to be on here and talk to you about what we're up to. So yeah, I'm Jules. I'm actually an accountant by trade. So I've been in the professional services world for around 12 years now, and I've been advising businesses on how they can improve their performance. So it's very numbers based, often quite intense hours, but that's given me a very good kind of grounding in the world of business. And I think, I've used that in setting up Ham Street Wines, which my wife and I co-founded around 4 years ago. So we've got 15 acres in the heart of Kent, just outside the village of Ham Street. 10 of those are planted, and we've got around 16,500 vines planted there. So it gives us a nice sized vineyard to kind of scale up and eventually, hopefully support one of us, full time as a business. But yeah, I mean, we've both been really interested in wine for a long time, and I think it's such a fascinating product. I think it's kind of the ultimate artisan product, if you like, because I don't think there's any other product out there that's really kind of obsessed over as much as wine is. The different grape varieties, the different regions it's grown in, and the different years, they all play a difference, and they all play their part in the ultimate expression and flavor of the wine. So I went down a bit of a rabbit hole, trying to understand, everything about different grape varieties and different regions and how they varied. And we started hearing about the success of English wine, and there's a number of big producers that have put English wine on the map. So the likes of your Nye Timbers and Chapel Downs, for example, who planted vines back in 1980, 1990. So it's been a long, slow burn, but now they're getting international recognition. And we thought, as I'm sure a lot of people do, there's a very romantic notion of setting up a vineyard, which has been dispelled by all the hard work and hours we put in on it since. But we got interested in it, and I actually stumbled across a book by the guy who set up Chapel Down, and in that he put in a lot of kind of costings and some numbers, and actually off the back of that I was able to build a kind of business plan, and we worked out actually we could get something going here, and then spoke to a number of different people about getting into the industry, how it worked, just to kind of test what we'd thought about.
But had you worked in wine in another country, or how did you actually know what to do beyond beyond online and research? I mean, how do you find out how to make wine if you've never done it before?
Yeah, there's a great university in England called Plumpton, which they do degrees in enology, which is the study of viticulture and winemaking and everything. We actually just did a 1 week intensive course there, which really just crammed it all in. And by that point, we'd actually chosen a site for the vineyard and had bought it. So luckily, it kind of confirmed that we were doing all the right things. But we also, we just spoke to a lot of vineyard owners and growers around the Kent area in particular, and there was a couple that have been really helpful for us, in understanding, what it all takes, and how to get it all set up. But then, we've just we've done a lot of volunteer days as well at other vineyards to kind of understand the process. But the great thing is, or maybe not the great thing is, we've got 16,500 vines. So you do one job and you do it another 16,500 times again. So you certainly get a lot of practice. And the other thing is, the first couple of years of setting up a vineyard are reasonably straightforward. So once you get in the vines in the ground, there's not so much disease pressure or nutrition management that you need to do in the first couple of years if you get things set up correctly to start with. So in that sense, it's quite a kind of slow burn in terms of building up the business and the vineyard to reaching kind of max capacity. But yeah, just speaking to lots of people, listening to lots of podcasts, reading lots of books, and doing it in practice.
So I'm quite fascinated by this sort of beginning part of this, because you obviously took over some land, and then you have to put 16,500 vines in. So first of all, what was the land before you took it over? What kind of condition was it in? And then secondly, where do you actually get 16,000? How big are the vines when you plant them? And that's got to be a lot of heavy lifting at the very beginning of your journey. And then how long before that actually gives you something you can use?
Yeah, so the land that we bought was a piece of arable land, and I think it had been farmed arably for the past 50 years or so. We can go back on Google Earth and see that piece of land back in the 50s, and it looked like it's still farmland back then. And I think from a kind of conventional soil test perspective, all the kind of key nutrients were there, and the pH was right. So from a kind of soil test perspective, it kind of looked pretty good, and there wasn't really any major changes we needed to make to it. However, we use some slightly different soil tests that help us understand the carbon in the soil and the organic matter, and I think that certainly showed that the organic matter levels were pretty low, and that's something and we'll come on to talk about it, I'm sure, that we're really focusing on building up over time. And also the visual evaluation of the soil was, it wasn't great. It's clay soil, so it's quite it can be quite compacted and quite firm, and we didn't see much in the way of kind of worm life and life in the soil. So that's how we inherited it, and we're really hoping to kind of regenerate that over time. But in terms of the vines themselves, well, again, there's a number of consultants in England who help with the establishment of vineyards, and they order vines either from the Champagne region or Germany, typically. And then those vines are around 18 months old when you plant them, so they're kind of they look like something out of Harry Potter because they're covered in wax, and they're about a foot long, and they get shipped over. They're left in cold storage, which obviously isn't with us, and then they're all planted actually in a day, because there's this team that came over from Germany with a GPS guided tractor, and they kind of plant it all up. But yeah, there was literally a lot of heavy lifting to start with, because we had to get all the trellising in, all the vines, and we kind of transported a lot of that to the site. So we're talking about tons of steel getting dumped on the vineyard, and that whole kind of planting process, planting the vines was a day, but then you've got to get all of the trellising in and all of the the rabbit guards and things like that. So that was another kind of 3 weeks worth of getting everything set up. But I think again in England it's got a lot easier now than it would have done 20 years ago. So there are teams that will come in and get all of that planted up for you, and that's what we did, which made our lives a lot easier.
Amazing. Wow. So it is almost what I thought is like a massive job at the very beginning, and then you kind of your hands off for a bit. But you sort of alluded a little bit there, and obviously you've kind of led very nicely into my next question. But there are so many different ways that you can produce wine, and correct me if I'm wrong, but we're not bound by the same kind of rules that you would have in France and things like that. So. But you obviously, and the reason we're talking is because you guys have decided to go down the route of farming in a regenerative way. What led you to that decision, and what does that mean in the context of wine or a vineyard?
Yeah, I think we've realized fairly quickly that there's farming is obviously very important. It's fundamental to all of us, but it is at the sharp end of a lot of the problems in the planet today. We're living through the 6th mass extinction event, And I think, the excessive use of fertilizers and pesticides and, tillage and all those sorts of things are certainly playing a big role in that. We wanted to farm and do things in a very environmentally conscious way. And we didn't set out to kind of stick a label on ourselves or follow a specific process to start with. But when we were setting up the vineyard initially, I think all the advice was, focus on having a clean base on the land, till it, glyphosate it, put down conventional fertilizer, and really try and push yield from your vineyard. I think we certainly don't want to follow yield at all costs. And we kind of, we're thinking in the back of our mind coming to this fresh, we don't want to do all those things unless we absolutely have to. And that's when we started looking into initially organic certification. So we are converting to be organic. But even that, has its limitations as well, because, you can be kind of conventional organic and all you're doing is replacing one product that kills something with something else that kills something. So
yeah,
we wanted to do stuff in a way that is trying to rebuild the soil and bring life to our soil. And, let's face it, wine, and people might not thank me for saying this, wine's a luxury product and we probably don't need more wine to solve the world's problems. So, we felt very strongly that we need to do things in that environmentally conscious way, and regenerative agriculture kind of ticks all those boxes in that. I think it takes things further at looking at how we can improve life in the farming operation, be that under the soil or above ground, and really trying to minimize our inputs. So, not using pesticides and fungicides, really reducing herbicides, and really reducing fungicides, whilst also trying to integrate biodiversity and life into your operation as much as possible.
How does that, so, the principles of regenerative agriculture I understand quite well when it involves animals, and you're sort of building ecosystems around, what is essentially the product. But when you're growing a crop like wine, for example, what are you doing? Are you planting like cover crops in between the vines? Are you what actual? Because I know I think one of the first contacts I had, I think, with Lucie was she got in contact with us asking if we knew any sheep farmers that could graze your vineyards, which I thought was really, really interesting. The idea of putting, planting pasture in between and having sheep graze them. And I was thinking, well, that might work, but aren't they just going to eat the leaves off the grapevines? And how does that work? And did you ever manage to get the land grazed?
So we've actually got 30 rare breed sheep on there at the moment, which is great. So with vineyards, the easier thing to do with sheep is to graze during the winter. There's no foliage on the vines, so actually that they're not going to nibble away at the vines themselves, or at least they shouldn't do. You can never quite trust them, but so far it's been fine. But they'll keep down. We've planted a cover crop, and they've certainly taken that down to a nice level, and that should hopefully reduce the need for things like mowing during the season. Obviously, they're also kind of cycling the nutrients and literally kind of fertilizing the soil there. We're only going to keep the sheep on there for another couple of months. So when we get into the growing season, they'll be taken off and they'll go back to the farmer. Although I have heard of vineyards that have managed to train their sheep not to eat the vines, which I think is the next level for us. Yeah. There's also miniature breeds of sheep that you could potentially integrate in there. Yeah, exactly. And of course, things like chickens and geese as well could be incredibly helpful to bring into the vineyard, because again, they're not going to eat the vines, but they'll keep the cover down. They'll be scratching up the soil and they'll be adding life into the soil. I mean, some of the fertilizers that people use are literally chicken manure. So again, you're just bringing that onto your operation, and again increasing the diversity of the site.
So as a closed loop, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, I mean, in terms of how we are kind of applying regenerative agricultural principles to us, we've got cover crops on the site. We've, that was a mix of around 15 to 20 different varieties of plants, and some of them are nitrogen fixing, some of them are wild carrot and radish and things like that that are breaking up the soil. And they're all just adding complexity to the soil layer, pulling up nutrients from different levels. And that's the idea. If you start getting that soil system working, then you're freeing up nutrients that might have not have otherwise been available to the vine to take up, and you're making the vine healthier. So I think cover crops are a big part of it, and we've already seen, say things like our worm counts have been increasing over the last 3 years substantially, which I think is showing that the structure's being improved and the health of the soil's being improved. But the other big part of it, as I kind of alluded to before, is not just chasing yield. And I think one of the other things that we're really focused on is, alongside soil health, is improving the plant health. And we're using something called sap analysis to understand the health of the vine. And traditionally, when people are managing nutrition in a vineyard, they'll look at soil tests and they'll look at PTL analysis, which is another plant tissue analysis. But both of those are really limited. Soil, you can look at soil test and it will say stuff is in there, but it doesn't actually tell you if it's been taken up into the plant. Whereas sap analysis really shows you what's actually going into the vine. And the PTL analysis is very limited because it gives you a view of nutrients that's something like 40 days old. So it's actually kind of completely out of date by the time you look at it. So we're able to use the sap analysis to really understand the nutrition, and then we'll apply generally just micronutrients to try and adjust that health of the vine. And I think we've certainly heard around the world that people are using sap analysis to really produce kind of disease resistant crops that are so healthy that you won't need to spray any fungicides to actually control mildew pressures and things like that, which we get a lot of in the UK because the plant is so healthy. So it's really exciting. We did a lot of sap analysis last year, and we were spraying stuff like manganese, iron, molybdenum, all these little trace nutrients instead of just applying potassium, nitrogen, phosphorus. So yeah, I think that's one of the kind of big tools that we're using in the vineyard, and just allows us to be a lot more targeted. And look, once we get the soil health working and the plant health working, again, it will be that virtuous cycle, and we should get pretty good yields from the vineyard as all of that is working anyway. So the yields for us will be a byproduct of what we're doing in the vineyard with soil health and plant health.
Yeah, amazing. As you were talking there, it made me just kind of think, and you were talking about, in Britain in particular, there's problems with mildew, but like traditionally, England hasn't been a wine producing area, and it's, even though France isn't that far, it's, they've been making wine for hundreds of years. But what's changed? Why? Because I've come across some extraordinary English wines, like you mentioned, Nine Timber and Chapel Down and the Uncommon, which I just think are superb. But what's changing, and which grapes are doing well here, and what did you decide to plant and why, and how is this all different to maybe 100 years ago?
Yeah, well, I think England has seen the average temperature increase by about 1.5 degrees over the last 30 years. And that's essentially moved the climate that Champagne had in the 70s and 80s up into the south of England. And so, alongside that, though, people started planting the Champagne varieties, so Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier, in England, and actually found that they did very well. Previously, people were generally growing Germanic varieties or hybrid varieties, which, one, they don't have great name recognition with anyone, but two, I think the ripeness levels weren't quite there, and a lot of people didn't particularly like English wine back in the day. But like we touched on, those pioneers planted those champagne varieties, and they've done very well as a result of that warming. And we've got a lot of the same soils as we do in France, and it's just kind of snowballed from there. And certainly there's been a lot of investment in the south of England, particularly in planting vineyards, and we've got a lot of people who've come over from various parts of the world. So I think there's a kind of critical mass of people that have got extensive wine experience from around the world working here now, and that's kind of raised the quality alongside the climate change as well.
And are English wines sort of being taken seriously by consumers or producers on the continent? I mean, there's are we being respected or laughed at by our contemporaries across the water there? Well, what's the thought?
Yeah, I think we might have been laughed at in the past, but we've certainly started winning a lot of international awards. Many of them up against your champagnes and other fine sparkling wine regions around the world. And I think sparkling wine has been what's put England on the map, and that's been the kind of big trend over the last 30 years. That focus on sparkling wine, and so I think sparkling wine in particular is certainly being held at a similar level to champagne and other fine wines around the world. It's still got a way to go, and I think the name recognition and the recognition of England as a fine wine region is always growing, but it hasn't kind of reached a kind of tipping point internationally. But it's certainly getting there. I mean, the English wine has kind of grown and grown over the last 10 years. So I think we've doubled the number of acres in the last 8 years. Wow. In England. And I think they forecast around 15 million bottles of wine were made last year.
15?
That's predicted. Yeah, 15. Wow. And that's predicted to get up to, say, 40 million in the next 20 years and be £1 billion industry. So there's, it is growing quickly, and alongside that, the kind of international recognition. But it's interesting. I mean, a lot of the traditional wine regions are having to adapt now to climate change, and obviously we're almost a bit of a beneficiary from that. But a lot of the traditional wine regions, the temperatures are just getting a lot hotter than they would have done in the past. And it's fascinating. In Burgundy, I think the records show that they were traditionally picking grapes back in October, because that's when they were getting ripe. They're now picking them, as early as kind of late August, because the temperatures are a lot hotter throughout the summer, and that's just meaning they're reaching ripeness a lot quicker. But that's causing all sorts of challenges as well, because fundamentally it's changing the character of the wine that they're making as well. And so, there's a huge amount of change, I guess, at the moment in wine around the world, and England seems to be becoming, a better region to make wine in. I think I'd add, though, that I think that, as I kind of touched on, sparkling wine has been the area where England has done the best. But I think still wine, England is producing more and more really interesting still wines, particularly white wines, but increasingly rosés and red wines as well. And I think we'll kind of see that trend continue as probably the temperatures increase a little bit here, but also, the winemaking gets better and better.
Interesting. So I of course, if we're getting warmer, so is everyone else. It's not, it's not isolated. So which grapes have you planted, you guys, and when, where on the sort of timescale of actually having, labels on bottles and retailing are you, and how does all that work?
Yeah, so we planted Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier, and also some Pinot Gris and Bacchus. So they are traditionally grapes that will go into sparkling wine or white wines. But Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier, you can make a really nice red wine from that as well. So depending on the vintage, we will be able to make any style of wine that we want, really, which is great. And we kind of chose that based on what has done well in our region, and there's some fantastic producers growing those grapes, and obviously kind of commercially as well, it makes sense to plant stuff that people love and recognize. Certainly Pinot Noir and Chardonnay are two examples of that. But yeah, I said,
sorry, so you've planted Pinot Noir, but you're not sure whether you're going to make like a champagne style wine or a Burgundy style red out of it yet, because it's down to how long the skins stay in as to whether it's a red or a white wine, right?
Yeah, our approach is to go very much off the vintage and what that growing season has been like. We are, we're pretty flexible in that sense. So we'll only release wines that we think kind of match the vintage we've just had, and generally where you've had a hotter year and a sunnier year, you've got more chance of making a good still red wine. And if you've had a really challenging vintage, you're more likely to produce a sparkling. And of course, I think the really exciting thing there is, following regenerative principles, it's really about how we can take those wines and grapes, and what ripeness levels we can achieve. Certainly some of the major wine critics have said biodynamic wines, for example, which are farmed very differently from conventional vines, they often have quite unique and different flavor characteristics, and do bring something different from a conventional wine. And I think with regenerative wines, that I think can take it even further if we really get the soil biology and
add more complexity, I guess. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. And so I think from that perspective, we're really excited to see where we can kind of take this, and how far we can get in terms of the quality of the grapes we're producing.
I love this idea of you not knowing exactly what you're going to make out of it yet. Because I mean, surely they're the processing of those two wines is quite a different thing. It's different bottles, it's different time, and if I presumably I don't know too much about winemaking, but I know that with champagne, the fizz is coming from a natural bottle ferment, and you have to replace take the yeast out and replace cork and that kind of thing. It's a whole different infrastructure setup. How will you manage that if you not decided what to do with it?
Yeah, so we are working with a winemaker who's got all the wineries facilities, and he has the ability to make those wines, different wines for us. But it's very much been so we've just had our first harvest in 2021. We picked 6 tons, which is roughly equivalent to 6,000 bottles. Due to the kind of costs of producing wine, we sold off 2/3 of that to the winemaker for him to make into his wine, and we've got around 2,000 bottles.
So most of the grapes you harvested at the end of last year. In fact, Lucie invited me to come and I was going to try and bring my daughter down, and I couldn't get for the weekend. I really wanted to come and fly the drone and have a look. And so most of that harvest from 2021 is going to be in other people's wines. Is that kind of what happened? You just contracted the grapes out.
Yeah, and last year was a kind of quarter harvest of what we'd expect in a full year. So this year we'll hopefully take kind of double that at least to turn into our own wine. But as we've kind of touched on, both me and Lucie are still kind of working in office jobs during the week. So
that's crazy.
It's only we don't have too much free time. But yeah, so we're certainly looking to initially over the first few years build up the production slowly, partly from a kind of cash position, but also just as we learn what kind of works in our vineyard and actually just selling the stuff in the first place. But the intention is over the next 5 years to kind of reach max production and turn all of our grapes into our own wine, which will get us to around 25,000 bottles. But I guess going back to your original question on, how do we, decide on what we're going to produce, we've got a bit of flexibility in terms of the winery has got the facilities there to be making a sparkling wine if we want. So then it becomes a decision during the growing season about what ripeness levels are we getting in the grapes, how are they tasting, what's going to work in the winery. And we're very much making that decision almost in the couple of weeks before harvest as to what we're going to
really
make.
late.
Yeah.
Because
and
you need
yeah.
like labels and customers and packaging and things. It's got to be, that's crazy.
Yeah, but I think it kind of goes back to that kind of regenerative approach in a way where we're and trying to follow quite a natural process in terms of making the wine. We're not going to, the crazy thing is in bottle of wine you can have 80 different additives, and they range from your yeasts, fining agents, and all that sort of stuff. And I think we again want to stay away from that and use as little as possible. And it'd be great to say on a bottle of wine, the only ingredient in here is grapes. But certainly then that means
you're not making natural wine. You're not doing that sort of style of like orange wine or natural wine.
We're going to be doing a bit of that, and we're going to be we're going to be doing a bit of sparkling wine as well. Mm-hmm. So again, with the grapes we've just got so much flexibility in terms of what we can produce, and again I think you can make some very interesting wines following natural processes, or doing things like field blends, which is a mix of a number of grapes or orange wines. Mm-hmm. And that there's a lot of producers in England, and a lot of them are following fairly kind of conventional still wines where they put the grapes in, they chuck the yeast in, and then that gives them a still Bacchus or whatever it is. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, but I think we wanted to make sure that again we were following something that's a bit different, and that's why we want to focus very much on what the vintage gives us in terms of the quality of grapes, but also producing slightly different styles of wine, which not many people do in England, but I think very much fit with our ethos in that we're not doing a huge amount to them, and we're very much following what that vintage has given us.
That's amazing. So it'll be kind of slightly experimental as the years go on, and will any of the wines that you produce, will they ever need to will they need some time to rest, or is it going to be pretty much harvest in the autumn, ready next summer kind of thing? What's the timescale in terms of actually getting it drinkable?
Yeah, so I mean, going back to your point on not knowing what we're going to produce, we picked all the grapes, we brought them into the winery and we pressed them. And originally I thought we'll do 3 wines, so we'll do something called a pet nat, which is the old way of making sparkling wine. So you bottle it with a bit of residual sugar and you get a lightly sparkling wine, and that you can release 6 months after harvest. So we'll have one of those, and that will be coming out in May or June time. And then the other one will be a field blend, which will be a still wine, and that's a blend of a number of different grapes in the vineyard. Again, because it's quite a small harvest, that works really well because you're using all the grapes you've got in the vineyard. And then I thought we would just make one sparkling wine, which sparkling wines you will leave to age for a couple of years before you release, and then you can actually age them for 10, 15 years if you want before you actually drink them. But we thought we picked some beautiful Chardonnay and some beautiful Pinot Meunier, which had really good ripeness levels and acidity for making sparkling wine. So we decided actually we'll make 2 separate sparkling wines from that. So we've now got that on the go, and this may change when we actually go and speak to the winemaker in a couple of weeks, but that's the intention. So we'll have a Blanc de Blanc, which is 100% Chardonnay wine, and then 100% Pinot Meunier sparkling wine, which I'm really excited about because I think Blanc de Blanc in particular, you can age that for quite a while.
Yeah. Well, that's like a classic champagne, right?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, it would just be really exciting to see how those develop, and then
I'm excited. I can't wait. And I know I kind of asked you this sort of off camera before when we were talking, but if there's any chance that I know you have a very limited run this year, but if
Yeah.
there's anything that we can retail, even if it's a couple of cases to our select clients, I would absolutely love to be honoured to get some to retail.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, we'd be happy to work with you. So I think so watch this space, because we are in the background kind of sorting out all the labeling and the branding and trying to make sure that fits with what we're doing. And again, that's all coming together. But I think the whole journey that we've been on, we've certainly been taking it one step at a time, with obviously growing the grapes and making sure we can really embed some of the regenerative principles that we want to follow. And now it's certainly then switching into actually getting all the branding and the labeling, and actually getting that wine out to customers.
Yeah, well, I'd love to. I missed out last autumn, but I really would love to come and visit, maybe this coming summer, and fly the drone, see the fields, see what you guys are doing, and we'll do a little interview. Particularly if we can get a couple of cases to retail, I think it would tie up a story. So I'm really fascinated with what you guys are doing, and dying to come and have a look.
No, it'd be great to have you down, and we offer we do volunteer days down at the vineyard. So obviously we did some for the picking of the grapes and the harvest, but we're also doing some at the moment for things like pruning, so actually cutting all the vines back and getting it set for the year. And there'll be other days we do throughout the year. I think at the moment we're not offering tours or anything, although if people are interested, do get in contact with us through our website, and then we can always look to arrange something. But the intention is, eventually to have
very community days. Yeah. And Jules, just remind, I'll put a link in obviously, but tell everyone where they can find the website.
So it's www.hamstreetwines.co.uk, and we're at Ham Street Wines on Instagram. So I think Instagram's probably the area that we keep update the most. So do follow us there.
Amazing. I think that's kind of wrapped things up really beautifully. Thank you